Welcome back to the DMV Autocross Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Garfield, along with Dustin Grubbs, and we've been kind of stuck inside our houses a little bit with the snow that came through, and I'm sure some of our all-season stuff is going to be more focused inside the house or maybe in a heated garage right now. What have you been up to, Dustin?
Oh, I haven't even cleaned off my car. I've unfortunately kind of slowed down on the sim racing, but I have been studying my last year's footage. Seeing what takeaways, what mistakes, what ruts was I falling into, and how can I learn from that and take it into this year?
Well, I think that's a great idea because in the off season you have all these videos you can kind of look at all at once, and you might see a common thing. And to that point, my wife and I were driving at Pro Solo Finale and Nationals, two events in the 1 week there, and after the event, I went and I started looking at both the videos from those events, and I realized that the car actually had a problem that was affecting both her and I while we were driving, and we didn't realize it at the time because you're caught up in the event.
Yeah, what was wrong?
So every time we made a left turn, the car was looser than when we made right turns.
Alignment?
Well, yeah, there was an alignment issue there, but
Okay.
It was just interesting because it was like, how did we not see this? Now, of course, part of that it's skill, part of that's just the moment you're in it and not paying attention enough to it. And so I realized I basically had to square the car again and do a better alignment. I think I was towed out a little more in the rear than I was on the right than I was on the left. So that's part of that whole off season figuring things out. And I actually got hub stands for this coming season so that I could do these alignments without having to pull the wheels on and off, which is really helpful. And I don't know how many people that have them. Some people do. They're a little more necessary for a car like mine. I'm kind of feel stupid that I didn't have them up to this point.
I would love to be able to check my own alignments. Like you were saying, I too learned from a video that I needed an alignment. Why does my car turn better one way than the other?
Right. And that's the thing. Once you can do your own, again, I'm not doing them perfectly, but I have control over that, and I know what's wrong, and I can fix it a lot quicker. So, which also leads me to what we're going to talk about this episode, which is a lot of tech stuff. And our first guest is actually Greg Sharpe, and we're going to talk about, sort of stock cars or street class cars, the restrictions, and then also the cars like ours, like mine, which is I can do just about anything I want with it. So Greg is with us now. Hey, Greg, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Good. And Greg has a mechanical engineering background, some RC car stuff, and understands suspensions a lot. And we're going to talk about alignments as that we all have to deal with throughout this sport. So we're going to try to keep it simple to start and talk about street class cars or stock cars in that sense, and tell us what you think about the alignment adjustments that we can make on some of those cars.
Yeah. So I think first off, we should acknowledge that street cars are kind of limited in a lot of the adjustments that we can use, especially when you talk about street class autocross. And even in some of the time trials where you're not allowed to go changing all kinds of like toe links and whatnot. So in that regard, I think it's tough for the average person to make a lot of changes because then they got to go to the alignment shop, and some alignment shops are real picky about, we can't go outside of spec. And then there's a question of, well, how do I make a change and see how it works on the track, and they get there and the tire pressures might be different. There's so many variables that go into alignments. It becomes this sort of like black magic, but it doesn't need to be that way. It really doesn't. Mm-hmm. I think one of the most important things is just taking notes and like keeping track of being consistent with tire pressures and temperature of the day and track temperatures and stuff like that, so that people can have a baseline to work from.
Now, what alignment stuff, the street class, they're going to the shop. What are they trying to do? What's their initial approach to a street class car that they're autocrossing?
Yeah. Well, once they've got underglow, after that, it's as much camber as possible, humanly possible, right? Just tuck them all in there. So it's about finding out what the limits of the car are, right? So a lot of cars are rather limited in how much camber they can run. And then after they get camber set, then it's a matter of picking toe angles and whatnot. Ideally, anybody who's just starting out trying to do alignments for the first time would go to the fast person in their class and say, hey, what are you running? And really, ideally, they'd have the same chassis, right? But that doesn't always end up being the case. One of the best things about autocross is that we get to run against different cars. So you got Civic Type R's and Ford Focus RS's and Mustangs and Civics, like Dustin's, everything running against each other, and we get to compare and contrast. So it's kind of not possible to go apples to apples comparison, but there are some good standards we can go by, right? So if you can get 2 degrees of camber in a street class car, you're doing pretty good.
Now, to be clear, negative camber, right? So we're talking about negative camber as opposed to positive camber.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if you could get 2 degrees of positive camber in a street car, but if you go back enough years, you go back into like the days of solid front suspensions. Now you're talking positive front camber, because couldn't do negative camber with them skinny little tires.
All right, so what's our restriction here? Why are these cars more restricted than, say, my car, for example, but any other, maybe Porsche or Corvette or something of that sort?
Yes, Brian, we know your car is awesome. We'll get to that later. All right, he just can't stop talking about it. So basically, we've got passenger cars. All right, they are restricted by things like where the steering rack can be placed, because there's feet that have to go down in feet wells, and there's crash testing that has to happen. Things can't just be smashing through the firewall when they hit solid objects, which people always find ways to hit solid objects in cars. So there are limitations, and manufacturers aren't going to pay to put a whole ton of adjustment into a car when they don't need to, right? So they will set up a car and they'll say, we're going to keep this car at near zero camber, and we want 1 degree of toe in, and as long as the adjustments are close, so that if a car gets into an accident, the body shop can get it back again, they're good. That's all the manufacturers need to do. And for liability reasons, they probably shouldn't be designing a whole bunch of adjustability into street cars, because people will find a way to get in trouble. I think the S2000s, the AP1s are probably a good example where they were lowered and they would just get crazy when you got them into the street touring classes and whatnot. And was it even called street touring back then when those cars first came out?
Yeah, it was street touring. Was when they developed the classes, they were initially called street touring. It was STS and then STX and then STU and STR. So yeah,
sure. So anyway, you get these wonky alignments, and there was no way to undo them, right? Like the cars would just get crazy. So manufacturers do have a responsibility to provide street cars that don't get crazy, and autocross cars can get a little crazy. There's some people out there that they dial in all sorts of negative rear toe, so the cars are trying to always walk down into the apex, and it can get fun. But starting out, I think the wise thing to do is to just even out some toe, see how the car bites into the corner. The last thing we want is for somebody to drive home from an autocross in the rain and end up backwards and in a ditch, right? We want to make sure everybody gets home and has fun with their car the next event too.
Yeah. So I drove a Mini. I had a 2002 Mini when they first came back into the country, and they were very restricted on camber, on particularly negative camber. I think it was about a half a degree that we could get. And I was talking to Dustin earlier, and we were talking about how we used to max out the camber, which again was not much, and then we would run crazy amounts of air pressure in the front tires to crown the tire, because otherwise you're using too much of the shoulder of the tire, which is what I wanted to talk about. Is when you don't have enough negative camber, right, you're going to end up burning off the shoulders of the tires, and we have to figure out ways to compensate for that. Let's talk about toe a little bit. A general understanding that Dustin and I probably both know, which is a little bit of toe out in the front, a little bit of toe in the rear, maybe depending on the car, of course, but that's a general understanding. Why do we toe out the front a little bit? What's the idea behind that?
So the cool thing about towing out the front is that you get real good turn in, right? The other cool thing is that it adds a bit of Ackerman. So if everyone's familiar with Ackerman, when you turn your wheels, they don't turn the exact same angle, because as a car goes around a corner, the inside wheel should actually be turning more because it's on a tighter radius as you go around. So by adding a bit of toe out, you're actually adding a little bit of that Ackerman back in. And depending on whether or not the factory passenger car suspension has any bump steer or any sort of change in toe as it runs through compression and rebound, you might be doing yourself a huge favor, because it turns that inside tire into a bit of an anchor, especially when you get down those really slow corners when you've overcooked it, because you'll cut the wheel really hard, and that inside tire is like, all right, now we're just going to throw the anchor out here, and we're going to drag this car around and give it a little yaw moment. So there's some fun things that happen with a little bit of toe out. There's not really a lot of bad that can happen with it, especially if you keep it within normal ranges. Some people will think like, oh, I'm going to wear my tires out faster. Traditionally, camber is what wears tire out faster, not toe. Even though when you're driving down the road.
What's that range? What's that range?
Yeah. What is the range?
I think it varies. And here's why. Different tire widths will have a different amount of squirm from the inside to the outside of the tire. So as you're driving down the road, if you have, say, Danny Cale's Porsche, right? There's a big tires, right? So if you point them in funky directions, you've got a tire on the inside that might have a lot of pressure on it, and it's being pointed really hard to the outside. And the outside of the tire might be really lightly loaded, and it's still pointed to the outside, but it's like, yeah, I can manage this amount of slip angle. So when you get into like, sometimes shops will do it in fractional amounts. So if you're talking like a 16th of an inch, when you get into those higher amounts, you're talking 1 or 2 degrees, and then that's getting a little egregious. But I got to be honest, I haven't had any big tire cars, so I don't know when those get crazy. I can tell you that even on the 285s that I had on the Mustang, when they got bald, they would tram line like crazy, and that would make any amount of difference in tow or even more camber just unmanageable.
So the car wants to wander down the road with the contours of the road.
Yeah,
I tend to go with somewhere around a 16th or maybe an 1/8 of toe out. Generally not like a 1/4 inch total toe. So that's the total between the left and the right. But that's why I was asking what you thought. And that's interesting that you say about the difference in a larger tire. I hadn't thought about it that way. I've always just thought about it being the same for all of them. What about the rear toe? I mean, again, I say I go a little bit of toe in the rear. Mm-hmm. Why do we do that?
I myself toe out.
Right. So. And you toe out because you're a front wheel drive car.
Front wheel drive car.
Yeah.
And to be fair, Dustin, your car is very stable. We had one of those, and the car, Honda did a phenomenal job with that car. The more stable the car is, the more crazy we can get with the alignments, and sometimes we need to in order to make it actually like rotate and do the things we want it to.
Yes, I've noticed that going from this Civic, a 10th gen, coming from an 8th gen Civic. From reading, the car would toe out in the 8th gen on compression. So you load the right rear swings out. But from reading, my new car doesn't toe out as aggressively on compression, so you need more static toe. So that has seemed to work, but I totally agree. It's definitely more stable.
Yeah, and you'll find if anybody's want to think about this through, and you're spectating this event, or you're going to another event, look underneath the cars. If you've got a car with a multi-link rear suspension, there's some fun stuff that can happen. Not necessarily street class, but Dustin brought up a good point. The 8th gens had a little bit of toe out on compression, and Honda, they knew what they were doing, right? When they went to the 10th gen, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not the same suspension. I think it's like a twist beam or something back there now. What is that?
I'm not entirely sure. This is just from reading. I know it's not the same as my 8th gen.
Yeah. So a lot of these front wheel drive cars, like some of the Volkswagens and a lot of the Ford Festivas or Fiestas, sorry, but yes, Festivas too.
Yeah, that's a torsion beam.
They'll do twist beams, and those are typically fixed toe, right? So it's just one toe setting as it rotates up through its compression range. So you have to again run more static toe because you're not going to get any change there. When you get into like street touring classes and you get into like street mod and especially XA, where everyone's having fun these days with underglow, you could do some crazy stuff. You can actually start to dial in reactive rear toe, and that makes cars just amazing. That's where we're seeing all-wheel drive cars start to do the things that we always dreamed they would do, right? Not the push monsters from street class where you're just like, why does my WRX never turn?
Well, that's the original WRXs or our original WRXs were horrific. I mean, I remember we were teaching schools back then, and I got to drive them for the first time, and they did not turn. You had to slow down, and that's actually what helped me learn to teach people how to control their cars better, which was you turn the wheel, it doesn't turn, you don't turn more, you never turn more, and you lift and you transfer that weight.
You get weight on the front. Yep.
Yeah. So what else would we think about? Is there anything else with a street car or with a more common street car? Is there anything else with a more common street car that we might adjust? We don't have a whole lot of room for negative camber on most cars. A Miata, we can adjust the negative camber on, right? We're going for max front negative camber. But like the Mini, for example, there was barely any adjustment and it was minimal. But is there anything else other than camber and toe that we would even do with a car like that?
I have heard some of the Miata guys talking about their caster.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
What are they doing there?
Yep.
Yeah. So caster, for everyone who's going to be following along here, the front struts are typically leaned back a little bit. So when you're driving down the road, the struts are leaned like this, and that's so that when you hit a bump, they don't have to try and articulate up. They can kind of go back with the bump. It also makes a digressive sort of spring posture so that they're not super hard as they get into the deeper compression ranges. But if you add more caster, the more you turn the wheel, the more camber you get. So caster goes a long way, right? So 8th Gen Civics, classic example, they had a lot of caster and like no camber. So when you really got into a turn, everyone's like, oh, they're eating through their outside tread. But they were actually trying to do a good job of keeping that tire flat. street touring, those cars become really amazing. But even in stock form, when they had zero body control and they're just sailing around in the wind, they did a pretty good job of trying to keep the tire flat by having a lot of caster. Now, the caster is not necessarily adjustable per se, but when you have a car apart and you're putting conies in it or something like that, take the top of those struts and pull them all the way back and pull them all the way in. You're only going to get like little minute amount, but it all matters. And then when you get into some other classes where you can start like shimming things, and I'm not terribly familiar because a lot of the stuff I've done was either like full blown like street mod stuff or it was street. You can start adding shims to the lower suspension arms that slide them forward. And some cars like cam cars, you'll see a lot of them where they'll have custom arms where the outer ball joint is swung forward by like inches. And that adds a lot of caster because a lot of those cars, they're not going to go they're not going to be doing coilovers or something like that. So they need to replace like those old nasty 50-year-old bushings and whatnot. So they'll just do a whole new lower control arm.
Well, and it seems like, in the aftermarket world, obviously they figure out the problems with the cars so that when you start looking for that competitive edge or just a performance edge, you're going to buy a control arm or a bushing setup or whatever it is. An offset bushing was common, I think, in an E36 BMW. Things like that you're trying to change what the factory did to be safe. You're going to try to get that performance advantage from the aftermarket. So let's talk about now get away from the sort of the restricted street class cars or the stock cars.
Sweet.
Let's talk about more of what you can do with a lot of the modified cars, or like I said, and the reason I mentioned my car is because as you get down, my car is, I guess, probably as close as you get to a formula car for the street. Mm-hmm. So I have those other adjustments. Let's talk about other adjustments beyond the street class that start to become available as you modify the cars or you get into a suspension like that's so adjustable.
Yeah. So the first thing everybody wants to do when they get into a street touring class or anything where they can do proper coilovers, they're like, I want to lower my car. And lowering is good. But the one thing it brings that we all need to be mindful of is a change in roll center. And what you'll see with front wheel drive cars with McPherson struts and rear wheel drive cars with McPherson struts, so where it's just a lower arm and then just a strut, so no upper wishbone. Those cars, as the front suspension arms become pointed upwards as they go out towards the tires, your roll center ends up lowering. And this is geometry that we don't have a whiteboard to do here. But when the roll center gets lower, it gets farther away from the center of gravity of the car. And as a really rough example, you can say the center of gravity is like where the head gasket is, right? That's a reasonable way of estimating it. The farther you get the roll center away, over the engine, you get a bigger lever arm. So the car rolls more. So lower roll centers, your roll center ends up getting like really low. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that as you lower cars, you don't bring the suspension arms way up, or you get ball center, lower ball joint correction, roll center corrections that put the arms back down. So they have like really tall ball joint out at the end at the knuckle. So those are some of the things you want to watch out for as you lower a car.
That's in a strut car. That's in
a strut car. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When you get into double wishbone cars, you will see a lot of angle, especially like some of the Miatas. Let's think what else had double. Even the older Civics, like the Del Sols and whatnot, they had double wishbones up front. Even when you get into those and you get a lot of angle, there's still a tendency for the cars to sit on the springs more than transfer weight directly out to the tire. So while the roll centers can still be in check, you still get this sensation. And off-road, this is more, you see this in off-road big time, right? You still won't get off-road cars that are all tucked up like that because you want the load to go out through the suspension arm and directly down into the path of the tire. You don't want to have to like go through the spring first. It's just one of those tuning aids that like take some of the weight off the springs and dampers, makes them less vital because not everybody has 10 grand to drop on some, awesome motion dynamics or whatever they're called. So we're typically in the $1,500 range for coilovers for most of us autocrossers that are watching us, or even, time trialists that are out doing stuff at Summit and whatnot.
Okay. So roll center and then what else? Obviously the more modified or the more sophisticated the suspension, we get more negative camber. We're not worried about that at all. We usually have as much as we want or need. And the toe is obviously adjustable front and rear. And you, go ahead.
You bring up a good point there. You say as much as we need. And I think that's where the mindset changes when you go from a street class car to a car where you have complete control over everything. The best example I can imagine is Aaron Shu is an autocrosser. He's got an Evo. He runs a street mod and XA. And over the years, his car has obviously become more and more wild. and it's gotten much wider wheels and tires. And I was chatting with him about it, and through his development, he's gotten to the point where the car was like super stiff and then it was more on the soft side, and he's got it evened out now to where he's using the tire appropriately. And that's really the bottom line for any setup. But when you go from street to like street mod, there's a huge difference in how you use the tire. You can't let a car with 305s roll a whole bunch because those tires don't have nearly as much roll capability. They're very roll sensitive at that point. Whereas when you're on a 225 or a 205 on a street class car, you can roll that thing all over heck in creation and the carcass will take it. But when you're running 35 series, like super wide tires, whether that's super wide for a Miata or your car, or whether that's super wide for, say, a Mustang, where some people are running 335s and crazy stuff like that, you have to be more mindful of body roll control. And that boils down to my Christmas present that Elizabeth got me this year. It's a tire temperature gauge. So we can go and check our settings and say, am I overloading the front end of this tire, right? And then when you get into the really fine nitty gritty of it, you can say, am I overdriving this tire, right? Because it's one thing to have the suspension set up where your roll is appropriate for the amount of tire you have and the course that you're on. But it's another thing to say, am I actually overdriving this, or am I underdriving it? I tend to underdrive cars. Like my tires take forever to warm up. I need to be more aggressive, was the feedback that I got when I shared some of my video footage on the WDCR pages.
So since you mentioned it, and I'll just, the tire temperature gauge or pyrometer is something that I use all the time. And the one thing that I like to stress to people is not only are you checking tire temperatures, but you should be checking air temperatures and surface temperatures because those things will all matter. And a perfect example is last time I was up in New Jersey and John Viddenvos and I were driving the car and we were on Nankang CRS2s or whatever they are. And the tires never came in. Even though the temperature out was 60, it was windy and the surface temperature was like 70. And so that same tire, when I was in about 65, 70 degrees, I was hitting 130 degrees tire temperature, which was great for that tire. But with a 60 degree temperature, but a lot of wind and not a real hot surface temperature, the tires were only getting to about 105. And that was well below the usable temperature of that tire. We can get into that at a different point, but the point being, when you use that pyrometer, you need to be thinking about a lot of things. And of course, that all comes back to whether you're using the tire correctly, which is an excellent point. And I'm glad you brought that up about you could have too much negative camber, right? That's what you were getting at, is you can have too much negative camber.
And you and I brought this up the other day. You could actually have too much tire too. And I want to say, this is going to sound silly. You could have too much tire for a certain club to run with, because there are some clubs that they don't move through the program quick enough, or they have a lot of like timing issues. And like, if you have too much tire, you're just going to lose all your temperature, right? Even with like, tire blankets, or not blankets, but I should say, the reflective tire covers and whatnot. There are some clubs you just can't work there. DCR, they run through so fast. Like, that's one of the clubs where I can always keep temperature up, even on the old lot at Waldorf. Like, it's, you move through the program there. Whereas other places where like it's more relaxed, it's chill. There's some timing issues, and like you're just kind of like, okay, well, I don't have any pressure anymore. So then you have to go back and change your tire pressures because now you're on like run 4, and you're like, well, time to build more heat. I
had never thought about that in terms of the clubs you run with, and that's really interesting, especially on the DMV Autocross podcast, because all the clubs kind of run differently, and how many runs you get, and how long the day is, and all that stuff. That's a very great point, because the longer you sit, the less temperature you hold, and the less grip you have when you go back out. Or if it's a 100-degree day, maybe that's a good thing, because you're not overheating the tires or trying to cool them off as much.
And we have it good here. There are other regions that have 3 or 4 places to race, but like, I want to say like half a dozen different pieces of pavement that our tires are going to run on between the various clubs. Because of course there's a bunch that share up at Summit, and there's a few that share at Ripken. But like, Prince George, I don't think we're using next year, unless you want to go to Corvette Club. So they're still going to be there. But we've got the Waldorf site. We've got, of course, how many? There are 3 or 4 pads out at Summit that you can use, including like track cross and whatnot. Right. And then, there's a lot of places that we can go and play, and we should be thankful for that. But it does bring up, hey, where does your tire work the best? Where does your tire heat up the fastest? Which lots are more abrasive?
Are we talking about alignment changes for these different lots? I mean, if you really got down to the nitty gritty?
Yeah, because some alignment changes will heat tires up faster. The more aggressive your alignment is, the faster your tire temperatures will come in. And some you'll blow right by. So when I was on, ironically, not AO52s, when I was on RE71s 2 seasons ago, I could very quickly come back up over the temperature curve, and I was just toast for the rest of the day. Like, I had to just like almost like take an easy run in order to really like hit it hard for run 5 or 6 if I was with a club that could get that many runs in. So that is something to be said. I have too many cars and I have toddlers, so I don't get to change my alignment settings. But if I had the time, yes, there are sites that I would say, you know what, I'm going to run a little more aggressively here.
Well, and those different sites have different grip in the pavement, right? I mean, there's the timing of the runs, there's the grip in the pavement. I guess what in the end with any of this alignment stuff, you really have to think about, for those of us who don't have a team that's going to do these changes all the time, you really got to think about what's your goal in terms of your final alignment. You want it to work as many places as it can work, and reliable and understandably predictable. Sure. So you're not going to make too many changes where you're thinking about, what piece of pavement am I on and how is that going to handle differently. You just want the car to be friendly to you most of the time. Yeah.
And it's probably worth saying, if someone's going to do track cross, they might want a bit more of a predictable setting, right? There are a lot of lots where I have no fear whatsoever spinning the Mustang, trying to over rotate the thing and going for a flyer. But, Prince George Stadium, when you got to, cut through the chutes like you're in Star Wars, running through the trench run, and that's not one of the places where I want to be sideways, getting close to that chute. And then track cross, I don't really need to be sideways. I'm not winning any trophies. There's nothing going on there. So that was another place where I would say, hey, let's make this thing a little calmer on entry so that we can be consistent, because consistency pays great dividends, believe it or not. Everyone thinks like, oh, I want to lay down a flyer. I'd be like, try being consistent first.
Yeah.
Get your tires in a window.
And that also, one of the things that I look at is if I'm concerned about the lot that I'm running on, or the safety or something of that sort, I might tow in the rear a little bit more, maybe a little more stability, so that I can have the confidence to know that it's not going to step out too quickly on me. So that's great. Greg, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you coming out. Thanks for joining us. We'll probably have you back on the show sometime soon.
Cool. Happy to do so. Take care.
Thank you. Dustin, you had mentioned earlier the video that you're watching in the off season, and our next guest is going to talk about data, which is similar to watching over that video all the time. So we'll bring in Daniel McFarland now. Hey, Daniel, welcome back. Looking forward to talking to you about data.
Hey, Brian. Hey, Dustin. Good to see you guys again. Good to be back on. I know last time you and Dustin had both said that you wanted to start running more data and wanted to get more familiar with that this year. Yes. But we didn't really talk about why you would want to do that in the first place. Like, why would you want to start running data? Why haven't you in the past, and why would you want to in the future?
Yeah, and I started to, but I'm still a noob to it, and so I want that information on how I can best use it. I'm hoping to, of course, improve my driving, not necessarily even long term, sometimes just immediately at the event.
Yeah, I myself want to see like the facts of line choice, speed versus distance. I'm always doing things by feel. That felt faster, but I know for a fact that I've driven lines and in turns that felt faster, but were not. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing that I ran into last year. I think in the August event at SCCA or at Waldorf. I ran 2 laps that were about a tenth off of each other. You couldn't really tell that it was all that much faster, but going into a showcase, I ended up carrying a lot more speed the second lap, and you could see it in the data trace that, hey, I'm carrying 3-5 more miles per hour all the way through this and gained 0.3 there. And, I screwed up right at the end and lost almost all of that again. But I could see going into the fourth run, hey, I need to do this again. I gained a ton of time in this specific corner. So, yeah, using it to get faster, comparing against yourself, comparing against a co-driver, yeah, that's definitely a good time to be using data. And you can take that data and really show that to someone else. If you're just going off of, hey, I drove it, how did I do at the end? The only thing you've got is time at the end. And maybe if you were evaluating your run as you were going through, I fall into that trap a lot where I'm looking at each cone saying, hey, was I 6 inches off that cone? Was I 2 feet off that cone? And then I look up and realize, oh, the next cone's right in front of me. I need to leave the evaluation for after.
So one of the big things, obviously, is that ability to instantly look right after the run and know whether you've messed something up or done something better.
Absolutely.
Like I just came back from run 3. I shaved off 5/10, but where? Like where did I pick it up? Was it the start? Was it the showcase? Was it the finish? Like where did I do it? Or was it just a gradual gain all throughout?
Or perhaps you really shaved off a second, but then blew another
Lost.
corner and lost half a second there.
Yeah.
So you can definitely use it to see, all right, how did I do against myself? So if you're looking at 3 runs at a national event, and you go out your first run, you set your time, you go out the second time, see where your pluses and minuses on some of those corners. You can go into that third run knowing, all right, this is what I need to do in this corner, and I tried this, it didn't work at all. Don't do that the next time.
Yeah, and I had one experience a long time ago when one of the softwares was newer, where Danny Ko was out at the event, but he wasn't running at the time, and he let us my wife and I use the data, and he was able to show my wife right away, right after her run or right after my run, where I was going through a turn faster, which obviously the car can do, and she's losing a ton of time there. And he was able to tell her, and she went out on her next run, improved that spot, and knocked off a half second just by doing that one turn better. And that's, I think, where it just seems so critical that if you have the technology and you know how to use it, the benefit is there even during the event. I think that's important to understand.
Yeah, but in addition to having the data, you also need to interpret it. So Danny was there to say, hey, this is what this squiggly line means, and go do this different. So I think, you can't do that if you don't have the data at all. But once you have it, that familiarity with, I made a mistake back here where I cut off this corner a little bit too much, and that impacts me in the next cone and the next cone and the next cone, and I see my time delta changing up here. That's not necessarily where I made the mistake. The mistake was back here. Mm-hmm. So learning to interpret that data is also going to be very important for understanding how to get faster.
Okay. Now let's talk about the options. Okay. So obviously there's data, but it's more than just go out. You don't walk into a store and say, I want data. So talk to me about what the software options are.
Yeah, a lot of the software is going to be on your phone. I think there's probably like easy, medium, hard kind of levels here as far as how much effort you want to put in, how expensive the software is. You have some things like Track Addict that are free, but don't necessarily work with some of the higher end GPSs or with cameras and stuff like that, but it's also free. You have things like Race Chrono, where if you put in a lot of effort, you can actually get a lot out of it, but it's still really geared towards track driving. And then you have Solo Storm, which is kind of the go-to for autocross, where a lot of that is set up for you. All you have to do is just you set your points at the event, and then you just go out and run, and it can kind of take care of, all right, well, I'm switching from this course to that course. It handles the pro solo stuff for you. It's also expensive. It's also about $200 or more at this point in order to get that set up. But it also works with all the best GPSs. It can download the video from your GoPro as you're going back to grid. All of that is extremely helpful in seeing where you gained or lost time.
Okay. Is there any other software options?
There are a few out there. Things like Harry's Lap Timer, or I think there's like a Porsche Connect app or something that you could use as well if you've got the right cars for that. I haven't really had as much luck with those sorts of things. I've really stuck to Track Addict early on. Race Chrono for most of it. I've dabbled a little in Solo Storm, but I want to start using that a lot more this coming year. I think that it would allow me to understand more at the event. Hey, this is what happened immediately, because I'll have that video feedback in addition to the data. Whereas with Race Chrono, I'd have to overlay those on top of each other later on.
Does it help that if everybody's running Solo Storm, does that make a difference too? If that seems to be the popular one, does it make it easier for you to compare data?
Absolutely. I know there were a number of times where Andres Rodriguez would come up to me and say, "Hey, Daniel, I need to know, I want to overlay your data on mine. I'm running SoloStorm." And I said, "Well, I can give you this giant file that has all my data, but it's probably not going to be all that useful to you because it's not in the right format."
Okay.
Whereas if we were both using SoloStorm, I could have just said, "All right, here's my session. Go do whatever you want to."
So what's needed next?
So data is helpful, but you really need video as well. If you don't have the video, you're not going to really understand you're not going to be able to share that data with somebody else. So most of the software will allow you to import a video from something else or run the internal camera on your phone if you're running it on your phone or tablet. But GoPro seems to be the one that's most well integrated into most of those apps. I know the GoPro 8 that I've got has both a high resolution file and a small low resolution file that SoloStorm is able to pull immediately as you're getting back to grid, overlay that on top of the data so that you can see, all right, when I got to this corner and I gained 3/10, well, what did it actually look like? Where was the car placed? Rather than just some squiggly lines around what I think is a cone. I can see, oh, I was 6 inches off that cone, and that let me cut through straight without having to go all the way around a corner and lose a ton of speed.
Now I have older cameras, like 15 years old. These are Contours. This was the main competitor for GoPros when they came out, and I still love them. They're still my favorite camera, but of course they're not integrated. Is there any way I can use them with SoloStorm?
Yeah, so a lot of the apps will allow you to import the video later on. So after you've already run the data, you've probably finished the event at this point, but you can take that video off of your camera, move it onto your phone or tablet, and then open up SoloStorm and import it from your phone or camera. So then you probably need to do a little bit of adjusting to make sure that the frames of the video line up exactly where the data is. But it can be done. But if you have a GoPro 5 or newer, probably, I think, is most readily supported, those SoloStorm can actually turn on the camera, start recording for you, and immediately have it synced up with the data for you.
Nice. Now
I would say that the GoPros haven't really changed all that much in the last 4 or 5 years. So if you've got anything in GoPro 8 or newer, it's all going to be about the same. There was one where they removed the GPS from the camera itself, but if you're looking to get the most out of the data, you kind of need an external GPS in order to figure out, where precisely was my car, not just necessarily whatever the GoPro can figure it out.
Okay, so let's talk about the GPS options then.
Yeah, so the most recent one that's come out has been the Racebox Mini. That's been a cheap option as well as a really high refresh rate that allows you to get the most data out of most satellites that are connected to the GPS and get the most accurate lines of where the car was going through the corner. It helps that it's not as expensive as some of the older options. VBox Sport was one that I had used for a while. It was a bit more expensive and not quite as accurate. The reason you would want one that has a higher refresh rate is that you get more data per second. It's pinging the satellites more often, but it's also going to connect to more satellites so that if you happen to have the tree line at Summit Point, right next to Washington Circuit, you don't lose connectivity with the satellites, or if it's raining and you got a whole bunch of cloud cover, it can still connect and still give you accurate results all the way through.
And some of these are waterproof. I've noticed. I know the V-Box. I had one of those from a long time ago too, and that was waterproof. It could stand on its own. You could have a remote antenna. And then the Racebox Mini, I believe, is also, waterproof as well.
Yeah, it doesn't have an external antenna, so you need to run it outside. It does have magnets that you could attach it to the top of the car. I've been running it connected to like a RAM mount, just kind of screwed in. That might be messing up the lateral and longitudinal forces that are going on, because it's kind of on top of a little pedestal that's kind of moving around a little bit.
Yeah,
but
I noticed
it's
that,
easy to take on and off.
right. I noticed that because that Racebox Mini has what we call a quarter 20. It's this thread size that's in the bottom of it, so it's designed to mount to something like that. But you're right. I mean, if you get any sway in there from the device that's holding it, it could change things a little bit.
Yeah, so I might play around a little with attaching it directly to the car this year to see if that helps at all. Because I would see things where the car, or I turn the car and then half a second later in the videos I see the G-forces suddenly move all the way over to the right and then come back a little bit. So I think that mount is messing up my data a little bit.
Let's talk about that. We've got our GPS, we've got our camera, we've got our software. Now it's perfect, right? It's always going to have perfect information for us.
Not always. There are times where there's just not much you can do. You forgot to turn on the camera. You forgot your microphone at home, and so now you're just going to get wind noise the entire time. Maybe it's downpouring out there. You're just not going to have the best signal. So there are times where the data just isn't there for you to be able to analyze it. But I would say, 9 times out of 10, I don't have any issues. All I do is get to the event, set up the cameras, attach my GPS, turn on the app on my phone, and I'm good to go.
It seems to me that once you have the right equipment and you know how to use it, it becomes very easy to set it up and go very quickly and not think about it a whole lot until you need to look at it and analyze it, right?
Absolutely. And if you can get that familiarity with the software at home prior to going to the event, that is going to go a long way towards being able to help you at the event so that just being familiar with autocross in general. The same sort of thing applies to, hey, I've been to a local event once, and now it's still unfamiliar. I don't know what's going on. Versus, I've been to Waldorf 100 times. All I do is go in, show up for tech, and then go walk the course, and I'm good to go. You're just, the more familiarity you have with it, the easier it's going to be to say, all right, well, I just made that run. How do I actually look at the data and compare it to the previous lap? Or maybe you don't want to compare it to the last lap because I hit a cone and the software doesn't know that, and I don't really, that's not my fastest lap. I want to look at the previous one from that.
Right, and I mentioned in the last episode of the podcast that when I got my latest one, I went out on the street and I played around with it so that I did not have to deal with it on location while I'm trying to race. I already knew click this button, or if I need to make a change or a different co-driver, I was a little more familiar with it. And that's a great testament to what you're saying there, is that just becoming familiar with it right away is or when you're not at the event is more key. Thank you so much, Daniel. This is great. This is a good start. We're going to have you on multiple episodes so we can get a little more advanced as we do this. So thanks again for coming on, and we'll see you on the next one.
Absolutely. See you then.
All right, Dustin, let's head on to the Q&A. Okay, so our first question comes from Jim, and he's asking about how and why autocross sites are picked. Well, to start with there, you got to go obviously back to, I guess, more closer to the beginning of autocross, which is still earlier, much earlier than me. But we had blue laws. So if you're familiar with the fact that a lot of autocrosses happen on Sundays, that tradition doesn't really need to be around anymore. So there are some on Saturdays and so forth, but most of them were on Sundays because of blue laws, which was state laws that required businesses to be closed on Sunday. And by doing that, that meant every shopping mall parking lot, every big area parking lot was free game to have an autocross on. So you had just a huge amount of options back then, not to mention the fact that I'm going to go ahead on a limb here and say most of the events were not as high speed as they are now, as we try to do now. There's always been what's called speed creep in the national level world, where people are saying the courses are getting faster and faster. But I would venture to guess that you go back. Both my parents used to run in the late '60s, and they ran an original Mini. And I'm going to guess that at that time, with those tires and that car, power wise, traction wise, they probably weren't hitting more than 40 or 50 most of the time, as opposed to where we get to the 60, 70, 80 range a decent amount now. So those blue laws would shut down those businesses, and you would have all those choices, which is where you get your Sunday autocrosses from. Obviously, over the years, that doesn't apply anymore. In fact, I think when I was younger is when it started, when things started becoming more open on Sundays, so you couldn't do them on the shopping malls and the, the movie theaters or wherever these big parking lots were. But
so when you were mentioning malls and theater, like, so what do they need for these sites? Is it its size and safety, right?
Right. So you need a big parking lot, preferably without any obstacles, such as light poles and curbs or islands, that sort of thing. So you can imagine most of the ones we go to in the DMV now, some of them are smaller, some of them are larger. But in general, you can build a course between or staying away from a lot of those obstacles to make autocross the safe sport that it is. And then you have to think about, the surface.
The condition of the lot.
Yeah, the condition of the lot. I mean, there was so if we go back to when I started, we ran at Harry Grove Stadium in Frederick, which is now Nimio Stadium. It's something like that. It's some sponsor. And that's a pretty small lot, but only, I think, 2 poles on it. But it's a small lot, so it can't have too many poles anyway, but it has 2 light poles on it. And a lot of those courses would cross over themselves. If you've been to the Potomac pad, think of it as a half Potomac pad size is what I would say. And we also ran Rosecroft Raceway, which was a horse track that had a sort of an overflow parking lot to that. That one, when you talk about conditions,
I was about to ask.
It started to turn into a bit of a rallycross by today's standards because the pavement starts breaking up.
When you said overflow parking,
yeah, and we paddocked on gravel, which is not the most convenient when you're running stickier tires and on and off that area. But before my time, or sort of right around my time, they were running, like, Camden Yards was pretty new, and a long time before the Raven Stadium opened, you had all that space was a lot of extra parking lots for Camden Yards. I never got a chance to run on that. There was Colony 7, which was actually an NSA overflow parking lot, which was pretty crazy to be running on an NSA parking lot, but somebody who worked at NSA was an autocrosser and encouraged somebody to let them run there. So that's how sometimes those lots get found, because somebody works at one of those locations and can kind of have a leg in to ask somebody, hey, can we use this on the weekends? And then let's see, obviously FedEx Field, which was, which was pretty close to, not too far from the beginning of when I started running in 2002. And once that came around, it was the premier, and still could be the premier lot in this area. Bowie Stadium was, operating at that time, so people were running there. And Waldorf, I'm not sure if anybody was running there yet. Six Flags, which is also in that same Lanham area of the DC Beltway. So there's been a lot of choices in the DMV over the years. It just comes down to what's convenient and cost and condition and that sort of thing. Colony 7 was actually the first time I ever saw an autocross. I was driving by it, and they were autocrossing on it. This was 1999. And I called my father on the phone, and I described it to him, and I said, is this what you used to do? And he said, yes. And I turned around and went back to that lot and pulled up and stared asking questions.
Just spectating, pulled in.
Spectating.
Started, talking to drivers. What are you doing?
Yep. And cool. I met a lot of guys that are still running with us now from back then. And I talked to them about what car to buy and I went out to buy, and I bought that because I was in the market at that time, and I went out and bought that car and started autocrossing. But a lot of those lots have obviously changed, and now we've got Summit Point, where the Washington circuit was originally built as a training pad, which is why it has the grass strips and stuff like that. And I think they weren't getting a lot of use out of it, and it became a go-kart track, and it was a semi-permanent go-kart track for a little bit. And then that business dissipated, and they opened it back up to try to run some autocrosses on it. And we were actually approached back then to run there. The Potomac pad, which never had a name, it was part of the government contract for Summit Point, and it was used as a training pad for that government agency that was over there. So it was never touched by anybody in the racing community. It wasn't allowed. It wasn't able to be rented or anything like that. So Potomac pad's relatively new as well. So a lot of these lots that we're talking about are generally larger parking lots with a good amount of safety to them. Things are spread out, poles or whatever, or maybe there aren't any. Obviously, some of the best facilities are going to be like a stadium parking lot because they don't have islands and they don't have as many poles. And there's a lot of them around that stadium. If you're allowed to use it, you might have choices. The other thing that we should touch on is the fact that as you start to run larger and larger events, for example, SCCA national events, a lot of them even happen on less used airports or unused military sites that are allowing and don't need clearance and are allowing individuals to rent or clubs to rent. So those become some of the best sites because they generally don't have any obstructions on them. Obviously, where we run our nationals in Lincoln, Nebraska is just absolutely enormous. So much surface area. I wish I had the numbers right now. But Toledo Express Airport is one of them. For a short time, we had a Wilmington airport in Wilmington, Ohio. And these are all ones, again, that just have no obstructions. And that's what your aim is. That's what your goal is to find the places that are wide open with no obstructions, easy to be safe, easy to have a very large event.
Yeah, just lower the stress levels.
Yep. Keep any incidents down to a minimum and be able to bring in more people to help pay for it. The cost is a huge part of it. It's how we lose sites. It's how we gain sites, depending on what that facility wants as a payment for that site as a rental fee. And then also the insurance. Sometimes some of the sites require higher insurance policies, and whether the club can afford that insurance policy comes into play.
What would change those factors? Bodies of water nearby, the amount of obstructions?
Well, in some cases, it's just the owners and how large the business is that owns it, and them looking out for themselves. So how much liability you have to cover, so there's not a lawsuit that will ever come back to them if there's a problem.
Okay. So just the value of the property,
or the value of the business that has the property.
Okay.
Right, as an overall.
Well, thanks, Brian, for sharing all that. That's really interesting, learning about all those old sites, some of which I've never even heard of.
Of course.
I saw that video you posted to DMV Autocross.
Yep, 1985.
Baltimore Motor Week.
1985 on the streets of Baltimore as a promotional thing for when the Inner Harbor was somewhat new. And we have a lot of members that are still members with us and a lot of past members that are in that video. And it's just really cool. I've been talking to them some lately about how nostalgic that is. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it looked like a lot of fun. Checking out all those old cars, the Mustang, the Lotus. That's pretty cool stuff. Very
cool. Yeah, well, thanks for helping me out, Dustin, and thanks again for watching, folks. And if you have any comments or suggestions, DMVAXpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll see you on the next one.